Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, a podcast where we take a look at books that are about or include archaeology, but accessible to anybody. I'm Tristan Herenstein with the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Barbara Clark. Hi, Barbara. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm excited to talk about this book.
Today we are digging into the book The Dig, written by John Preston and published in 2007. So this book is based off, it's kind of, you can think of as kind of like historical fiction, I think, right?
Yeah, I would say so.
So Barbara, give us a little historic background on what's going on here and what's going on in The Dig as far as the history is based off of.
All right. So Sutton Hoo is a real site. It's in England, and it's called Sutton Hoo, which I thought was a very strange name for an archaeological site, because it was, if I remember correctly, it was named after the home site that was there, which is called Sutton Hoo. This site is an Anglo-Saxon site. It sits on the river, if I'm saying this correctly, Deben, and it changed the way we think of Anglo-Saxon people. Throughout history, we kind of thought of them as, for lack of a better word, uncivilized. But apparently, according to Sutton Hoo, what they found there, these folks had a really, really elaborate burial ritual, ceremonial complex.
Quite a lot of not architecture, but complicated metalwork.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at some of the artifacts that were found there, especially I know the mask is what everybody thinks of when they think of Sutton Hoo. The artisans had to be phenomenal. I mean, I feel like I was reading a little bit about some of the replicas that were made for museum exhibits. And even with modern day tools, the artisans were having to work really hard with the fine detail that was involved.
And if I remember right, and maybe so to be clear too, Barbara and I aren't European archaeologists. We're North American archaeologists, but so we don't know necessarily if this is the case or not, but I believe the term Dark Ages kind of started to fall out of favor because of sites like this one, because Dark Ages was supposed to be post-Roman. It was a period where, nothing happened. People went back to, the most basic rough lifestyles. And sites like this showed that, no, this was actually a still very complicated society.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And it's just, to me, it's just fascinating, too, that this site, it involves a ship burial, for those of you that aren't aware. Mm-hmm. They brought this ship on shore, buried a person inside the ship, and there were more than one burial at that site, but I believe one burial in the ship burial itself, and they believe it is, they can't necessarily prove this because the human remains inside the ship were practically gone. I believe they had to do some analysis on the soil to find out that there were human remains there. The soil there is so acidic, there were no human remains left.
Which is a problem we have a lot of times in Florida here too.
Right. But they believe, based on the time that this burial is thought to date to, that it was, and I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, but Railwald. He was in the East Anglian king, I believe, during that time period, and he was thought to have died around then. And they actually, in some of the other burials, I think they believe some of his relatives are buried at that site as well. So it's just, I mean, I don't know. I think it's fascinating because you and I are both historic archaeologists, and we know the importance of historic documentation. And to see a site in another country where they have historic documentation, obviously much older than what we have here, is pretty fascinating. And one of the things I felt sometimes when I'm learning about like European archaeology and European history, and I know we have Native American history here, but they didn't have the written word. But it just blows my mind as a North American archaeologist, the written record that some European sites have attached to them from, monks hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Right. So it was just fascinating to read. Like, my first instinct was, that can't be right. But it can. So, and I guess the documentation they do have comes from some monks, I believe. I can't remember, but yeah, there were some monks that wrote about Raewald and where he might have died and when he might have died and all this stuff. It's pretty fascinating.
Great. So thank you. That gives us some historical background. And the book details a lot of this, although this was, it doesn't tell us, who it was potentially, because at the time of the book, I think they didn't know.
Yeah, and I don't think that's really the focus of the book. Right. While the book is about an excavation, I think it's more about the archaeologists and the people that were involved in the excavation than the actual archaeological excavation or archaeological site itself.
Particularly what, at least in the start of the book, is probably our main character, who was an amateur archaeologist who didn't really get the credit at the time he deserved, from what we understand. It wasn't as bad as you might fear, but definitely he kind of was crowded out, I guess you could say, a little bit, once he started finding more than they expected. So let's go ahead and dive into the book. So this time we're going to actually do just about half of the book. So we're taking it up to page 132. And so if you're following along, or if you want to read along or whatever, you can kind of tell where we're going. We just thought this would be a more manageable way of talking about a book, and we'll just kind of see how it goes. And if we decide we like this, we may do this with future books in the future. So our characters, we have a number of characters, but kind of the main players in this first part, like we mentioned, Basil Brown. He was an amateur archaeologist, I think you'd say. So the book also, it takes place in 1939.
Right.
So we're talking just before World War II starts for England. And that is actually kind of an underwriting tension, an underwriting theme throughout. And we'll kind of talk about it as it comes up. But so this was a time where you were more likely to have amateur archaeologists, I think, working on sites, because there wasn't necessarily the training that we have now and the methods and techniques. I mean, this was a period where they were just kind of starting to figure out that we can actually learn about people from these things that they're leaving behind. We can analyze the pottery and learn about who they were. And before this, they didn't really have much of a concept of that. They were just looking for pretty stuff.
Right. Yeah. It was all about the things. And at this point in the 1930s, I'd say it still is about the things, right. But we're starting to see that transition into what we now think of as archaeology, as more of a scientific approach to studying the past, rather than just digging in the dirt and finding cool stuff to collect or sell or put in museums or what have you.
Right. Okay. So we've got Basil Brown, and our other probably most critical character is Edith Pretty. She is the landowner who paid for and got this excavation started. They owned the property, and she wanted to get the mounds excavated.
Yeah, I think she's an interesting character. For the time, she's a pretty phenomenal woman, I would say. And she's the one who kind of spearheads this just out of essentially her own curiosity, which doesn't happen very often these days.
Well, and according to the book, there's some shared curiosity with her late husband as well.
Yeah.
And then she has a very young son named Robert Pretty, and interesting for the time, at least. This was actually, she had this son fairly late in life for this time period. And again, that also comes into play a little bit. Now, if you are aware, there is actually a Netflix movie based off of this book. And now one thing I remember from the movie is that she is actually fairly young in that. And so they definitely did change that aspect of that character in the movie, which is an interesting choice, I thought.
And I think it was one of the critiques that a lot of people had of the movie compared to the book, because like you said, it's pretty significant for that time period that a woman would have a child that late in life. And I believe there was also a significant age difference between her and her late husband, maybe.
Well, and there's actually a few cases, at least one case where someone asks if her son is her grandson, which...
Right.
Yeah, very awkward, especially for that time, I think, too.
Yeah.
But she's like, nope. She doesn't really seem that concerned. She's
fierce.
Yeah. And then few other major characters that we kind of run into. We have Mr. Maynard and Reed Moore. I think I'm saying them right. But these are both people that Basil Brown works with, essentially. They run the local museum and local archaeological investigations. So he has connections to them through that. And then we also have, he comes in towards the end, his name is Charles Phillips. And he's not as critical, well, he's important in this one, but he has more of a role in the second half of the book.
Right.
So, but they're all important characters. These last three in particular, I think they're professionally trained, or at least they kind of are sometimes maybe of nobility, and because they have this way of throwing their weight around that just makes me think they're intended to be kind of, they expect to be listened to.
Right. And they're more seen as authoritative figures in the world of archaeology and in the museum world.
At least on their local levels.
Local level and that time period.
And Phillips on national level, because he's from the British Museum.
Right.
So he definitely throws his weight around a lot more. All right, so let's jump in. What I think we'll do is I've kind of got some notes highlighting mostly archaeological techniques that the book describes, and then I figure we can kind of throw in with any pieces we want to talk about based on characters or whatever as we kind of go. However, we start with a prologue, which has just some really good descriptions. So I thought I would just start, I'm not going to do this a lot, but I thought I'd just start by reading part of this and we can kind of talk about what's going on. That evening I came and worked on alone. The rectangle of darkened earth at the entrance of the burial chamber showed up quite clearly in front of me. I scraped away with the trowel, and then I switched to the bodkin. And they talk about bodkins a fair bit, but in this case, I'm picturing, so a bodkin arrow, I know, is just a spiked arrow designed to punch through armor. So I'm picturing this as being kind of a spiked tool. It implies metal, although we would usually use bamboo or wood or something soft when we're using a tool like that. So I'm not entirely sure what exactly they're using in this case, but I thought that was interesting. So he switched to the bodkin. It wasn't long after starting that it came across this greenish band. It was running through the soil like a grass stain. At first I thought my eyes were playing up. I had to blink a few times before I allowed myself to believe it. With the pastry brush, I swept away the earth, taking off as much as I dared. I was worried that if I took any more away, the whole thing would vanish completely. But far from disappearing, the green band showed up even more distinctly than before. So, what would a green band tell you if you were digging, Barbara?
Some type of metal, probably. Yeah. I know, especially copper and stuff like that will leave a green stain.
Sure.
So I can see, I would be nervous if I was him brushing that away, because there is a certain point where, I mean, archaeology is destructive.
Right.
You're destroying the site as you actively excavate it. So there's a certain point where there's no going back.
Right. And sometimes you're looking and the greenish band may be all that's left of the metal.
Yeah.
But that's why he's using that brush, I think, because it's not something actually we use as much as people think. But when we find something delicate, boy, that is a tool we definitely turn to. The first one, I found another green band. The color was a little duller than before, more speckled too, but still impossible to miss. I took these to be the remains of bronze hoops. There we go. Possibly belonging to a barrel or some sort of wooden container. When I looked at my watch, I saw that it had already gone 9 o'clock. I was astonished. I thought I'd been going for about 15 minutes. The light was fading now. Even so, I was in a muck sweat, which is an interesting term. I kept having to wipe my forehead with my sleeve. I knew I was going to have to give up soon, but I could not bear to stop. Not yet. Which I think we can also relate to. A lot of archaeology is very dull.
It's dull until it's really exciting.
Until it's really exciting, and then time just disappears on you, and it doesn't matter how uncomfortable you are. You're just focused on the task and investigating whatever it is you're finding. Yeah.
And I think they do a really good job with the imagery in this. And, another thing too with archaeology is sometimes you're excavating something and you're at a point where you can't stop. Like you have to keep going because it may not be there tomorrow. If the soil dries, if it rains, if wind sweeps it away, something like that. So I think we've all been in that position where we're like, we have to get this done today.
Yes. And as it will become clear later in the book, he was under a lot of pressure at this point too. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. In one place, though, it was quite solid. When I tapped the wood with my finger, it gave a soft, hollow sound. In the top left-hand corner, I could make out what I thought was a knot. Peering it more closely, I saw it was a small hole. A dry, papery smell rose from the ground. It caught in my nostrils as I sat staring at the piece of wood and at the hole in particular. Then I did something shameful, something I can never excuse or properly explain. I pushed my finger into the hole. It went in quite easily. The timber fitted snugly around my knuckle. Beyond was a cavity. Although I couldn't be sure, I felt the cavity be a large one. There was a kind of emptiness around my finger, like an absence of air. So, why do you think he described it as shameful? I wasn't entirely clear based on the description. I have a thought, but I want to see what you think.
My first thought was, you're essentially poking through an artifact, which isn't necessarily great. That is what I thought. Sometimes your curiosity gets the best of you, and you do something that,
or slight impatience.
Yeah,
and you shouldn't, because it's you've been working on it forever, and
you're just ready to get it done.
Sometimes, yeah. I think from what I can gather is it was actually probably filled with soil when he pushed his finger through. So definitely it's not something you should do. Because the way it's described, I thought it was already empty. But I think it was actually full of soil, and he pushed the soil out when he put his finger through, which, it's something you're not supposed to do for sure.
Right.
Because you don't know what you're doing. It could have been solid, and he could have broken it,
And that's the thing, too. We deal a lot with like ceramics and things and stone tools, but this is really delicate material that they're excavating.
Right. As we said, it was very acidic soil. The human remains are gone. Somehow, at least in certain layers, there is some wood left, which is pretty remarkable. Yeah, and then the prologue is odd because then it ends with him wanting to talk to Edith Pretty, and the butler says no, and then it ends. I'm like, well,
but if you read on,
it makes sense when you read the book. But for a prologue, I thought that was kind of a pizzled out after kind of an engaging start. But anyway, let's go ahead and start. So the way the chapters work in this book is they actually work with. they tell from different people's perspectives. So the first chapter is from Edith Pretty's perspective. And it starts us off with basically she is hiring Basil to come and excavate on the property. And so they talk a little bit about, what the conditions are, and they actually go out and to the mounds to check it out. And I forget how many they said she has, but there are actually, I want to say maybe like 5 or 6 mounds of different sizes on the site. And so he goes out and does some investigation. He comments on rabbits, how she's got rabbits that are on the site, and that's definitely something that we run into in archaeology as well. Rabbits or burrowing creatures, an archaeological site tends to be disturbed soil, which means it's nice and soft and easy to burrow through. And a lot of animals think that's a convenient place, but we'd prefer they didn't.
Right.
He also had some good talk about he expects some of the mounds to have been robbed at least. And unlike what we see with the looting today in North America at least, this robbing would have been what we consider now historical. He was predicting it would happen like something like 600 years ago or something.
Right, yeah.
So that's also an interesting thing because to our perspective now, that looting activity would also be an archaeological site.
Yeah, I kind of found this fascinating just because we have a tendency to think of archaeological sites as like this little time capsule. And, after the archaeological site is deposited, nothing's happened. And we see in all sorts of civilizations, historic grave robbing and looting that took place relatively shortly after that site was created.
Right.
So I just thought it was fascinating because as archaeologists, when we think looting, we immediately think of modern day looting, but these sites kind of evolve.
Right. And of course, this wouldn't be their perspective at the time, but now I'd be like, I want to know about the behaviors of the looters too, because that's kind of fascinating in a way as well.
Yeah, and why and
how they did it. And like they describe how they think it was going on, but I don't know if they have any basis. Like they think they would just dig a shaft into the middle of the mound and lower a child down to in this unsupported dirt shaft to hopefully find whatever they're looking for. So for reasons that become significant later, Ms. Pretty wants to actually dig in the biggest mound, and he recommends against it because he notes a lot of pitting and what he thinks was a shaft. And so he thinks that one's already been looted, so he says we should go after a different one. There's a bit I really like where she actually pulls out the, as far as we know, first of its kind soil probe, which is something that we use all the time now, but it's just a thin metal rod with a handle, and you just push it into the ground. And sometimes, it can be risky, and some sites it's not very useful. Like if we're doing something prehistoric, it may not be valuable, but if you think you have bricks on the side or something, it can be very useful. However, in my experience, typically it ends up being like an oak tree root and not actually anything.
Or it goes through the artifacts you're trying to find.
Right.
I've heard stories of them damaging like skulls and burials and things like that.
Right, because they're very fragile and you don't know what you're pushing it through. But in this case, it ends up being just a rock, which is like, well, that is par for the course, I think.
Right, yep, pretty accurate.
Yep. So she actually has a couple other men join him for the digging. They're going to dig. They decide on which one they're going to dig. And so he starts by trenching. And they describe it as almost like a wedge instead of like a even trench like we would do today, I think.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting because it was hard for me at first to kind of wrap my head around.
I think we had expectations for what a trench looks like, and that's not what he's doing necessarily.
Yeah, so I think that might put us somewhat at a disadvantage when reading this book as a modern day professional archaeologist. We have these preconceived notions of what certain things ought to be, and they aren't necessarily that.
Yeah, so they're doing kind of a pie-shaped wedge. I'm not sure how it seems to suggest it's like a quarter of the mound, but it's not a quarter of the mound.
I don't think so, yeah.
And they're doing that, I think, because mostly they're trying to get at the center because they think that's where the burial is going to be. Because again, they're not after, like we would be today, looking at different soils used, because, looking at like Native American mounds in North America, they're using intentionally different kinds of soil to help with the structure. I don't know if that would apply in this case, but they don't even have the concept of doing that kind of investigation as far as I see in the book.
No, I think they're still at the rapidly dig for the things rather than, we take it, layer by layer, centimeter by centimeter in very systematic layers, whereas they're just kind of like chuck the dirt till we find the stuff.
Well, pretty much. There's one point, it might be a little later on, they said they're taking off 6 inches at a time, which to us, I'd be like, what? You're going to go past everything then. Yeah, that's hard to imagine. But like we said, they'll miss the little teeny pieces of pottery and other things, but to them at the time, they had no idea how important those kinds of things could be. So that's totally understandable. Yeah, so this is where they describe that, actually. And then, so they have some nice interactions with Robert Pretty, Edith's son, and he kind of strikes up a friendship with Basil Brown, and they kind of have a nice relationship. I like that part of the book, at least.
I did too, and especially as a public archaeologist who deals a lot with children, it was kind of fun to see this child getting super excited about this site. That seems to be universal.
Yeah, and the book describes his situation. He's pretty lonely too. Like he has no kids around. His governess is gone because of the war coming up, and he's all alone kind of in the house. And so this is a really exciting and a good thing for him.
And I read somewhere too that in some later excavations, I think in like the 60s maybe, they were excavating and they would find little bits of Robert throughout the site. Like they found a pair of roller skates.
Okay, not literally Robert though, not bits of
no,
Robert.
Right. No.
That's a darker tale then.
Belongings of Robert.
Right.
They found some roller skates and some little toys and things like that scattered throughout the site, which I thought was really just kind of heartwarming.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they say archaeology is the tale of untold stories, discovering untold stories, and that often includes children because they don't appear, when there are historic records, they don't usually appear in historic records. And so that's kind of cool. I like that. I wanted to see what you think about this because Basil apparently tells Robert that there's one part of the archaeologist that's the most important. Do you remember what it is?
I don't.
The nose. And he tells his mom this, and then Basil laughs. So I'm trying to figure out, was he being a little bit serious, or was he joking, or was he talking in metaphor, and Robert didn't get it? I wasn't quite clear on that.
I'm not 100% sure either.
Because I wouldn't say the nose.
I wouldn't say the nose either. We both work in Florida. Right. It just smells like swamp here. So
yeah. Decaying things everywhere.
Maybe it's different. It's Sutton Hoo.
Well, I wonder if it might be a bit of metaphor. So he's talking about instinct, about where things should be, which is fair. I know archaeologists that are really experienced in an area and they can point at a spot and say there's a site there and there's going to be a site there.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I don't know if that was as maybe accessible as the author.
Yeah, but it also could be kind of literal because right after this, they talk about soils, which I thought this was really cool because they established that Basil is an expert in local soils.
Yeah, I believe his father.
Even more so his father.
Yeah, like he learned through his father, and that's what made him such a great amateur archaeologist.
Such an asset to everyone. Yeah. Yeah, and so he could be a little literal there because I know soils can have different smells, especially if you're in places like privies or that kind of thing. But if you're looking for something, a wooden structure, organic smells can be useful. So break down organic smells, richer earth rather than the more nutrient poor clays, that kind of thing. So maybe there's something there. I'm just not sure if that's what they're getting at or not.
Yeah, I that kind of took me back because I wasn't sure exactly what they meant either, because that's when I think of like an archaeologist, that's not what I would consider my most important asset.
Right. Yeah. So I'd like to know what he was actually thinking. Basil was a little bit there, but... Okay, so then we move on and we get some, away from the excavation, some activity in the house, some thoughts from Edith, and we get kind of our first signs that Edith might actually be ill here. And this is something I really like about how this author handles several of these things. He kind of puts in clues there, but they're not the main focus for what's going on. So he actually just kind of lets the slight illusions and possible interpretations ride for a while, and eventually it becomes more clear. I liked that he did make it more clear. But so there's initial signs that she might be ill. He also does that with tensions surrounding World War II. They're a little explicit, but a lot of times they're just kind of allusions to current troubles and that kind of thing. So we're back at the trench next, and there describes reinforcing the walls, which I was actually a little surprised to hear.
I was too, because I have seen excavations even later than 1939, like photos of excavations where they were not reinforcing the walls, and they really should have.
I've seen that 10 years ago, which was they're not supposed to be doing that. It's a major violation. But basically the rule is the dirt shouldn't be over the excavator's head for reasons we will see. Yeah. And so they're reinforcing the walls with timbers and things, which is great. I am intrigued that they use ladders to get down into the trench, which suggests that maybe the trench doesn't go out to the ground level.
Yeah.
Like they're sinking it inside the mound almost.
Yeah.
Because normally we would cut it out all the way to the edge of the mound and you just walk in from ground level.
Right. Yeah, I was having a hard time picturing what this excavation would have looked like.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a sort of sense, I suppose, because again, they're not looking for the soils. All that stuff is just extra work to them that they don't have to do. However, if you watch the TV show, they definitely take it out to the ground level. So it's not really clear on what they're doing there. But I thought it was interesting still.
Yeah, like I said, I was having a super hard time, especially after watching the movie.
Right.
Trying to figure out what was going on in actuality at this excavation. And what is more accurate, the book or the movie? I'm sure the real story is somewhere in between.
Right. Yeah, actually, that would be what we should do is actually look up some of the photos from the time period. Because the second half describes a photographer out there.
I've looked at some of the photos, and a lot of the photos are of, the ship excavated,
right.
People standing in where the ship is.
And it is late in the excavations too, so it could be a different setting entirely.
Yeah, I just wonder, I know they had photographers there later on after the site after they realized what they were excavating, but I really haven't seen any early photographs of just like the single trench that Basil.
Sure. And according to the story, the photographer wasn't here at this point anyway. So that's could be what's going on. So we just may not know. We may have to look at the actual notes someday and find that out. And so while he's digging in this first mound, he comes across what I would describe as an uncertain feature. They think it might be a burial chamber. I was trying to see if I could find it to read it real quick. The far end of the trench was a small pit. At the bottom of it, I could just make out a lighter color patch of soil with ragged, ill-defined edges. The outline had been marked with pigs and baling twine. So that's just a lighter color soil. So that's how we come across many of what we would call features. And features is essentially anything that isn't an artifact. It can be a fire pit, it can be post holes, it can be a burial chamber. The entire mound could be considered a feature depending on how you're looking at it. However, I thought it was interesting because how often have you come across a possible feature?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. No, you'll be thinking, like, for example, a root that grew into your unit and then maybe rotted away and it left a stain in the dirt, and you are just excavating around that for layers and layers thinking it's something significant, and then all of a sudden it just kind of piddles out and you're like, oh,
yeah.
Wait a second. And it's so infuriating.
Yeah, or rodents. Actually, we've just talked about them, and that's one of the problems we run into is like we run into a rodent burrow. Is like, well, is this a post hole? We have to treat it like it is because we don't know right now.
Right.
And it can be a lot of very slow, tedious work that ends up being nothing.
Right. And you and I have both done contract work where time is money.
Right.
And you find a rodent burrow, you think it's a feature.
That's time you could have been spending on an actual feature.
Right.
But you just can't know until you dig it. So that's
the nature of archaeology.
That is the nature of it. And this is where they start to kind of establish a little bit more of the underlying tension around World War II coming. So Mr. Maynard comes to visit, and Edith basically says something about the urgency of the excavation, which, again, this is a little unclear, or actually it's two things playing off of each other, right? Because he's already alluded to the fact that Edith might be. So she may be dying. And then it's also the war is coming, which she knows she's not going to get any of this done during the war. And so to her, this is implying that this is maybe her last chance to do this.
Yeah, that's true.
Which, again, it's a little unclear because you're not really clear if she's actually ill, what's going on, but he's kind of building up this implication throughout the book. And I really appreciated that.
It was also a little frustrating, though, because I want to know every little bit, every little detail, every little character's life. Uh-huh. And the whole time I was reading this book, I was guessing, what happened to Edith Pretty. And yeah, I went on the internet and took a deep dive into Edith Pretty because I wanted to know what was wrong with her.
Right.
So I appreciate the author not making that a distraction in the book, but in my mind, it became a huge distraction.
To me, it was kind of like an engaging mystery. Like, I want to keep reading because I think we're going to find out more. And it does pay off, at least in the book.
I guess I am more of an instant gratification type person.
Barbara just couldn't handle it.
I went on the internet.
Okay, so the site, this time though, the feature does turn out to be a feature, and they come across some charred wood. They describe it as a butcher's tray, although they never, which is, as they describe it, is kind of a wooden shallow tray. However, it's never established that that's what that actually is. They just start calling it that, which, again, that's 100% what people end up doing on sites. They decide this is the privy, so they start calling it the privy unit. And it may not end up being the privy unit because they don't know yet, but they start assigning meaning to it, which on one hand is good. On the other hand, it can lead to some biases that we want to make sure we avoid. So, but doing that kind of analysis while you're digging is actually pretty valuable stuff too. So I was never actually clear if this was actually a butcher's tray or what this actually was.
Again, I went to the internet.
Yeah.
And I couldn't really find anything. So I don't know either. And again, that's infuriating to me.
Probably to most folks reading this, though, they're just like, it's the butcher's tray. Then they stop worrying about it. But us, we just get kind of weird about it.
Yeah, we take deep dives and we have to know.
So now we get a little more building tension because Moore and Maynard come and basically talk to Edith Pretty and try to get her to let Basil go so that he can come to a site project that they're working on. And apparently they went to Basil first, and he's like, I don't work for you right now, which I really admire. And so they went to Edith to try and work it out, and they kind of come to an agreement that he will have, I think, a week, another mound, or I think it was a couple weeks, actually.
Yeah, it was a couple. I want to say 2.
Yeah, and then she would let him go to this other site. Because they're under pressure, too. They have a site they know is important, and they need to get this done before the war starts as well. So it's a tension all around. You know, everyone's position is pretty understandable at this point. But they're a little pushy.
What I thought was interesting about this, too, is most of the time, you know, I think of, especially during this time period, a museum taking lead on an investigation, on an archaeological investigation or an excavation. But in this case, it was kind of the landowner. I feel like I would love to know how typical this was for how this all kind of went down for that time. Because to me, it just seems kind of backwards. I feel like a museum would go to a landowner and say, hey, you have these really cool mounds. We want to excavate them.
Right.
But in this case, it was the landowner and a
very
female,
wealthy landowner, too. That's, I think, part of it, too, here.
That probably is part of it. But it was very interesting the way this kind of all unfolded.
Mm-hmm. So they're working on the butchers. Did I skip ahead? I might have skipped ahead there. No, I did skip ahead a little bit. Anyway, so go back to the butcher's tray, though. I like this because there's 3 men and they're trying to lift it out. And it's not going very well. There's actually can be quite a lot of suction on this kind of thing. It can be very hard to lift out. But to us now, we would actually dig around it and then start to dig under it and then lift it out carefully, where they're just like, we're going to put our fingers on and rip it out. And they get it up and then it breaks.
Womp womp.
And Basil's so angry at himself. And while that is always something we try to avoid, every archaeologist who's done this long enough has broken an artifact. And also, it's important to remember that archaeology is not about the thing, though, to us now. So even if it breaks, there's still a lot of information there. So it's not, to us now, it's not the end of the world. To them, that was a pretty big deal. And then actually comes the trench collapse. So he actually started on a new mound at this point. They gave up on the one they were working on, started a new mound, and Basil was actually working in the trench when the walls collapsed and buried him. And he was in there for quite a while. And it's frankly a miracle that he didn't die.
Yeah, I just can't imagine.
Right.
First of all, I mean, not only is there lack of oxygen, right, when you have dirt on top, but the weight of dirt on top of you, and like that's an archaeologist's worst nightmare, right?
And that's
there.
why you don't dig above your head. And actually, you know, and then they're trying to find him. They're digging with shovels, and I'm like, you could very easily hit the person, and you know, but you got to get him out of there, you know. So it's understandable. It's just like it's a very tense and well-written situation, I thought. And so then that's when Moore and Maynard actually come. That's when I skipped ahead. And so, you know, like I said, Basil was working on the new mound, and he's decides that this mound actually is not probably worth it either. And he knows he's got one to do. He has on his last one. So he actually goes out and looks at the biggest mound again, the one he decided was looted. And I thought this was fascinating because he ends up deciding was that unlike the rest of the mounds, this biggest one is not symmetrical. So he thinks what happened, and we have plenty of examples of this happening in North America too, is that someone actually borrowed soil from the mound and made it not symmetrical. So like a farmer pulled soil or whatever happened. And so when the looters came along, they thought they were in the middle when they were actually off center. So he thinks that there's a good chance that this one might have something in there. So they decide to actually go for this new mound.
I thought that was interesting because I think it shows how local knowledge is really important.
Right.
And
I like the analysis here because he's like, this isn't the same. I think this is what happened. Like he has some really good deductive reasoning going on here.
Yeah, I was actually really impressed with that, especially for the time, because I don't necessarily think of early archaeologists doing that kind of analysis.
Right.
It kind of changed my perspective on early archaeology, I guess.
Yeah.
He had
smart.
He had a scientific approach, a more scientific approach to it than I would have expected.
And we see that same sort of thing happening here in North America too. Monk's Mound, which is in St. Louis, is also the capital of a civilization we call the Mississippians, which was a huge society. They had influence all the way to the Great Lakes, down to Florida here. It was actually very extensive, and they were kind of known as the later mound builders. And so this Monk's Mound was a gigantic earthen mound before it was turned into a park, because you can actually go visit it now, and they've reconstructed the mound, which not something we do now, but this was probably done in the 60s when they did that. There was a farmer who was plowing the sides of this mound and turning it into for farming purposes, essentially.
Well, we see that here in Tallahassee, where we are located too. There's Lake Jackson mounds. Some of those were borrowed for roadbeds and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I know I've worked at sites, along right-of-ways, along roads, and I'm finding pottery that doesn't necessarily belong in that geographic area. Right. It was probably borrowed from a site, fill dirt was brought in from an Indian, like a Native American mound.
Sometimes it's not from a mound, though. I think sometimes they're digging from like a bank and
they
don't know that
or
a site's
something.
there even.
Yeah. But it's just, it happens.
It does happen.
I feel like it doesn't happen as much anymore, thanks to good laws that protect historic and archaeological sites.
Yep. Agreed. So they decide that this biggest mound, the one that Mrs. Pretty wanted to do in the first place, is probably worth doing. So they decide to abandon that one, and they go ahead and go at it. And the chapter ends with Robert or Robbie running into the house and telling Mrs. Pretty that Basil has found something. And that is where we end with this chapter. All right, so our next chapter, chapter 2, starts from Basil Brown's story, or is from Basil Brown's story, which is probably a good choice in this case because this is where he starts to uncover things, and there's a lot of really good descriptions of the techniques he's using. I really do enjoy it. But it starts with talking about how they've been digging in rain for like a week, which, miserable.
Not fun.
Not fun, and probably, if you're able to, you would just not do, because it does make the soils more dangerous. Like they already had a trench collapse. Doing that in the rain is even worse to do. And then it also, if you're finding sensitive things, then it can also be very bad for those items, especially if you're tired and poor visibility and whatever the case may be. But we've all had to bail out trenches, and I've had some cases where just the water table was even so high we'd have to bail out, dig a little hole, deeper part, and then bail that part out as the water collected down there. So sometimes you just have to do the best you can. And in this case, as we've talked about, they don't have much of an option. They need to get moving on it. So they have to keep going. One of the diggers, not Basil this time, found what he describes as a pink soil change, which is what I thought was an interesting description, because it ends up being like an iron bolt. But I wouldn't describe the rust you see from, iron in the soil as pink usually.
Yeah, I mean, not being familiar at all with British soils, I wonder if there's some type of chemical interaction there that causes it to be more of a pink than what you and I would be used to. Because I would usually, like the orange rusty color.
The only time I could think of where it might be pink was if it had been what we call in a oxidizing or deoxidized fire. Do I have that right? If it's in a fire where it doesn't get exposed to oxygen, an iron or steel nail will turn actually quite a bright red. And that could be what's going on there, but there's no description of like what this ends up being, the ship. The description of it being burned, and they would know that, I think. So I'm just not quite sure. Yeah, you're right. It could be the soils, though, for sure. So they find this bolt, and Basil basically stops everything and goes on a field trip because he thinks he's seen this before. And this is, again, like you were saying before, this is where local knowledge comes in really handy. So he knows of another excavation where what he thinks is a similar bolt was found. And it was tentatively identified as, that's right, he doesn't tell us right away. And it was tentatively identified, I think, as Viking, although the author, basically, way it's described, he finds the item, he looks at the tentative description on the card, and then the author never tells us what is on the card. So, but he reveals later he's thinking that he's working with a Viking ship at this point. But we're not clear. We're not clear yet, I think. But it does finally tell us he thinks it's a ship. And as they excavate, I thought this was cool too, because another fairly modern technique that we would use is he's mapping in where these bolts are, and he's using that to predict where the next bolt is going to be. And it's like clockwork. So every place he expects to find it, he is finding a bolt. So he's like, well, this is a ship, because it's also curving like a ship would. So it's pretty exciting. And also, as they're excavating, they're finding the bolts themselves. There is no wood left, but they are finding the impressions of the wood in the soil. So it's hardened underneath, and it's actually some very delicate excavating on their part, frankly.
I'm kind of honestly blown away that they were able to find this ship and the feature of the ship and in such detail. I mean, if you look at the photos, you can see the wood slats. Right.
So I'm sure preservation was quite unique in this, but even then, that's still very delicate excavating they had to do. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
I liked the part where they're talking about, well, this is kind of big and exciting, and we're going to have problems with people. So what we'll do is we'll rope it off and put up a sign that says live bombs, which I thought is just so classic archaeologist, right? Like, I don't do this to deal with a living. I want them to stay away. But I'm having a little fun here, but because, they legitimately need to keep people off for preserving the site. But they're also just like, we don't want to deal with people. Although Mrs. Brown, not Mrs. Brown, sorry. Mrs. Pretty does say that she wants to throw a party. And Basil is really not thrilled.
I love this dynamic
Yeah.
in the book just because I feel like it perfectly sums up how archaeologists feel. This is a delicate site. Like, yes, it's exciting, but we need to protect the integrity. Whereas, somebody who is not a trained archaeologist may look at it and be like, this is really cool. And I do appreciate her wanting to share it with the public.
Right.
She wanted people to come onto her own private property to share in this really cool archaeological finding, which I can appreciate.
Right.
I think that's neat because I don't think that happens very often, especially on private property, maybe on public lands.
Well, and her method of doing it is smart too, because if we don't have this set time, people are just going to start showing up all the time and it's going to be constant disruption. If we have a set time, we can tell people to wait till then. They can all come and see it. Like, that's smart. And again, that's another technique that was rediscovered, I think, at the Battle of Little Bighorn site in the 80s and has been rediscovered ever since, because every time like archaeologists do an excavation in a populous setting, like, so many people came by, we just had trouble getting things done. So we had to come with methods to deal with it.
And you and I have worked at sites as public archaeologists where other archaeologists will bring us in to deal with the public so that they can deal with the excavation. They're like, okay, you guys do the people, we're going to do the excavation, which
I appreciate that they realize that's of value too, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think I think more sites should allow that.
Right. Okay, so there's a little bit of a snafu with the site because he's basically in bed and he realizes the wind is kicked up and he runs out there and the tarps have all blown off the site, which is, again, really lucky because it could have been a complete disaster. Like, that could have destroyed their site. They have the boards impressions preserved, get that inundated with water, and now you had.
Yeah.
So he managed to get it covered back up again, and like the next day, like, holy cow, I can't believe we're so lucky. And like, yeah, that was incredibly lucky.
That was a stressful moment in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it's going to continue on, but I felt so deeply for him in that moment. Yeah. There was so much at stake.
Well, and he was fighting so hard too. Like, he's out there alone in the dark, trying desperately to get these covered back up. I think he does have someone show up and help him eventually, if I remember right.
I want to say like the gardener.
I think one of the people working with him eventually. But he's at first trying to do that all on his own. And remember too, you have a big site, you're trying to get a tarp over by yourself while not stepping in the site and doing damage, which is almost impossible. So, wow. Yeah, that was a very tense time. They find signs of the looter shaft, which, again, I am still very interested in, but I get that's not the point, so fine. And then Moore shows up again at the site, and this is where you kind of not liking him too much, although he's a bit of a jerk. He's very critical of Basil's record keeping. Like, demands he sees the field book and like, these are so messy. You need to do better than this. You're representing us. And like I said, he's gives him a total dressing down. Really not pleasant about it. But he's not wrong either.
He just lacks tact.
He lacks tact. He feels like he's in charge. I mean, we've had these bosses.
It's a lot of ego.
A lot of ego.
And I feel like it honestly shows some of what happens in archaeology now. We rely pretty heavily on, the public and avocational archaeologists, and we have volunteers and things like that. And I've been in situations out in the field where you do have volunteers and it gets a little, egos get involved and it gets a little dicey.
Right. And sometimes it comes down to, we have certain ways we do things in archaeology that's not immediately clear why we're going to this extra trouble.
Right.
And I think that can cause tension for sure. And so it's just a matter that, the avocational archaeologists and volunteers we work with are valuable. We just need to make sure.
It comes down to communication.
Yeah.
And in this situation, there really wasn't great communication.
No.
And I don't think they got off on the right foot to begin with.
Well, they already knew each other at this point, but this definitely soured Basil, and understandably so.
Yeah.
Like, you feel angry for him. Even though, as an archaeologist reading it, like, I think Moore is probably correct. But, yeah. So,
but I also think there was a little bit of bitterness and Moore. He was
putting Basil down.
Yeah.
He was, like I said, he was being a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
He was establishing his credentials and his authority. Like you said, ego. So definitely not very sympathetic, even though I can kind of see his point underlying the meanness. So Basil, at this point, decides that the looters did not get to the burial, which is great news for him. And he changes his tactics to focus on the center rather than uncovering the whole ship. So he's now going just after the burial section where he thinks is going to be in the middle. And this is a lot of it's due to pressure from Moore. And like I said, too, Moore is under pressure as well. Moore wants him to come to this other site, and they all are under pressure because of the war is coming. They know it's coming at this point. But that's what's going on, and, you're under that pressure, you got to do what you got to do. So it's probably a smart decision, I think. At this point, he actually describes them starting to do shovel skimming, which I thought was interesting. I think we actually touched about this a little bit. Once again, I propose working in layers from the surface, first moving in one direction, then coming back to the other, taking off about 6 inches at a time. Which, like, they're in the burial chamber at this point.
I
Stop
know. It blows my mind that in such a rich, essentially, site with so many delicate artifacts and features that 6 inches is considered acceptable.
And that's them being careful at this point, too. What were they doing before? No. Yeah.
Ugh. It was stressful to read because you're like, no. I mean, it makes me wonder what was missed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know they found a lot, and in subsequent excavations they found more.
And they went through the back dirt even, I think, and found quite a lot too.
It just
and that's common for the time.
Yeah.
That's happened with Native American mounds in North America too. They were excavated looking for the pretty things. Excavated, I think quite often it was loosely archaeological. And then the people go back through the back dirt, and there's tons of material that they just never saw, didn't even know it was there. So they come across a discolored spot that they think might be the burial chamber, which is probably good reasoning considering where they are and everything. At this point, there's another little mystery alluded to that's not really described. Some random guy tries to climb down into the pit. And Basil's like, no, it's too delicate. You're too heavy, because I guess the guy is a little overweight. And it's a little tense, but finally he gets him to leave. And this, I'm almost certain, is Phillips.
I think so,
So he's from the British Museum. He's shown up at the site, and he's maybe a little too on point, but throwing his weight around. No pun intended there. So, but he thinks he has a right to be there in someone else's excavation without talking to the person who's running it, which is bad manners.
Definitely.
So again, even though at this point we don't know this is Phillips, you're not really inclined to like the guy too much, I don't think either.
Yeah, to be honest, there were a lot of characters that I did not care for.
Right.
And they're all from these, like the Ipswich Museum, the British Museum. Like, I was just like, these museum guys are here again.
Right. Which on one hand, you could read it as, those professional archaeologists are all a bunch of jerks, don't see any value in the other folks. But definitely these guys are jerks. But I think, and we'll see this in the second half of the book too, there is merit to their training.
Oh, 100%. Like I said, they need to work on their communication skills.
They need to be, yeah. And they need to see the value in what Basil's doing too.
Yeah.
Even though it's not to how they would like it done, they need to see the value in Basil himself, frankly.
Yeah.
So we move on. We're discovering some more details about the ship. Basil's wife comes to visit, which they have a nice relationship too. I like that.
I love her.
Yeah.
She is
remarkably supportive of her husband who's off digging all the time, which, as we know, archaeological fieldwork can be very hard on relationships because you're away a lot of the time, sometimes weeks or months on end.
And now, I mean, in this day and age, we have cell phones, we have Zoom, we have, she was writing him letters, I think almost daily or something. Like it just, I can't imagine. I know it was more commonplace then for, couples to be separated for a certain amount of time, depending on the profession and situation. But she's just remarkably supportive and remarkably positive. She's very supportive of what he's doing, and she's encouraging. And I definitely give her credit for that, because it could not have been easy. And I feel like he like me, and probably you, he dives deep into things. And I can just imagine he becomes quite obsessed with whatever he's studying to the detriment of everything else, because apparently he was really big into astronomy as well. And so, I mean, you have two very nerdy things, which I love.
Yeah.
But two things that you can dive really deep and become kind of engulfed in. And to have a wife that is supportive of that. Yeah. Good for him.
Who gets grumpy about your books, but otherwise is very supportive. He's got too many books, they say at one point.
Which I'm sure every archaeologist listening to this is like, oh yeah, we've had that conversation.
Yeah. So the discolored spot was revealed to two discolored lines now. And so he has a theory for what's going on here. And there's a third line that they find. The original burial chamber probably sat in the bottom of the ship with a pitched roof, much like a picture of Noah's Ark in a child's storybook. The Osberg chamber, that's another excavation he's comparing this to, seems to have been built like this, as far as I could tell from illustrations in Maynard's book. But at some stage, the roof must have fallen in, most likely due to the weight of soil. The fall seems certain to have dislodged the contents of the chamber. Of course, there's a possibility it might have been crushed in the process. So I thought I'd just read that because I was trying to think about how I could summarize that, and it's pretty well laid out. And I can't do much better than that. So he's got a theory for what's going on, like we talked about. He's doing analysis as he's actually working through his excavation.
And I do think this is a really good illustration of how the scientific process works.
Right.
A lot of times we think of science as this stagnant thing, and any type of scientific investigation, as you gather more information, you are better able to make a determination. And so sometimes that can change based on new findings. And I think it's really important to point that out, because a lot of people tend to think of archaeology as like, once the excavation is done, you know everything,
right.
Or once you found something, you know everything about it. But it's about the broader context.
Right.
It's about the artifacts that are found in association with that one artifact, or that one site that's found in this region of similar sites. And the more information you gather, the more accurate your understanding of the past becomes.
Right. And on the note of the scientific process, I want to point out that I used the incorrect word to describe what he thinks is going on. We use theory in daily speech to mean just kind of a guess. And essentially, what we should be saying in this case is hypothesis, because they are actually very, very different things. So he has a hypothesis for what's going on. And as you described, he's going to test it, and it's going to be further tested throughout and into the analysis even after the excavation. Okay, so they move on. They find a slab of clay, which again I thought warranted a bit of a read. Within a few minutes, I came across something solid. Working outwards, I found the edge of this object and began to trowel my way around the outside. So he's actually going around the outside this time instead of trying to pry it out for now. After a couple of hours, I could see that the object appeared to be made out of clay. It was about 3 feet in length, 8 inches wide. There's a dip in the middle. In this dip, I found a number of stones and 2 small fragments of charcoal. So again, I don't know that we have a lot to describe there, but I thought it was just kind of give you an idea of what is actually going on. So this is a significant thing. Whatever it is, this is a good sign. And so it does establish, though, that he's never seen anything like this before. So this is kind of a unique and unusual thing from his experience, even Basil's experience. So at this point, things kind of go a little wrong for Basil, because they find a coin, and just at that point, they're told to stop digging. And it turns out that Phillips is here along with Maynard and more. And Phillips says, I'm going to take over, basically. And this obviously upsets Basil a lot, because he's kind of being pushed to the side, which he shouldn't be. I'm not sure that Phillips is wrong to want to take over necessarily, but he is wrong to treat Basil this way, honestly.
Oh, 100%. I wish I could go back in time and see how this actually went down.
Yeah. Because remember, we're kind of dealing with historical fiction here.
Right.
So this is the interpretation of the author.
Was Maynard really as...
Phillips.
Or excuse me, was Phillips, is this an accurate portrayal of him? And I know Basil didn't receive proper credit until years later. Mm-hmm. So it would just be really interesting to see if this is kind of creative license on the author's part.
Right.
Because, you need an evil character in a good book. So I would just like to know how accurate that was.
Yeah, it's very believable. Though to be clear too, again, Phillips, I wouldn't qualify as evil.
Right.
He's kind of an antagonist at this point.
Right.
But it does become clear in the second half that he legitimately cares about this stuff too. He shares a passion. It's just a shame that he doesn't recognize that passion in Basil, I think.
And I also wonder too how much the kind of stereotypical view of archaeologists as up in their ivory tower, how much that influenced the author in his portrayal of the different characters. Right.
So it may be even more unfair on Phillips and those guys. It may be unfair to them how they're portrayed even. And, that's the thing with historical fiction, right?
Yeah.
You have a lot of the author's interpretation of how things might have been to make a good story, which makes it fun to read. And this is fun to read, to be clear.
It really is fun to read. It's an awesome read. It's not a very difficult read. And even though, a lot of archaeology books sometimes are kind of dry, this one's not.
Right.
And I think it still has a good amount of archaeology in there, but its focus is kind of on the characters.
Yes, agreed. Yeah, it has some very good archaeology. It does a good job describing things. Usually we've had a few places where we're a little unclear, but by and large, it does a great job of talking about it. And actually, it helped me understand that the archaeology at the time could be better than I thought. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Many times it was not. Many times it was, backhoes just digging into things. But there was potential, at least. People at the time, some folks knew how to do this better than I understood it to be the case. So I like that. I appreciated that about this. So we kind of wrap up Basil continues digging on his own. He finds this, and this is where the prologue basically steps. He finds the hoops, pushes his finger into the hole, which he shouldn't have done. He's not supposed to be digging, to be clear, but he's upset. He went out there by himself in the evening, basically, to do it. Kind of a little stick it to the man, I felt like, and yeah. And then Phillips takes over the excavation, and we move on to the next chapter, which we will pick up next time. So any closing thoughts? We kind of did that, I guess. But
yeah, I really like the character development in this. And like I said, I wonder how much of it is accurate and how much of it is creative license. And I think it's a really good book to show. It gets people excited about archaeology.
Right.
I feel like, I mean, I know I'm biased, but
right.
It gets people excited about archaeology without it being dry, but it's also not completely, Indiana Jones or something like that. It's more of an accurate portrayal with it being still exciting. So I think this is a really good book for people that are interested in archaeology, but they don't want to dive too deep into the actual archaeology. It's more about the adventure of the characters, because I would consider this an adventure.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. There's drama, there's tension, there's a lot of good stuff. Like you said, very easy read, very fun to read, and good representation. I always harp on about it's not about the things, it's about the story. And it tends to be a bit more about the things, but there's definitely, it goes beyond the things as well. So I do appreciate that about this book.
Yeah. And I just think it's a great portrayal of how I feel a lot of archaeology happens even now. It's somebody who is curious about something and they contact an archaeologist or, an avocational archaeologist who does something. And I think it does a good job of showing how the archaeological community is bigger than just the archaeologists.
All right, so I think that wraps us up. I think we've talked long enough for this time. If you want to join us next time, I think we're going to shoot for about monthly, I think. As far as podcasts go, I know that's not as frequent as some, but we have jobs to do beyond this too. So we
books to read.
Books to read and other stuff to do. So this is a program of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and we are a public archaeology organization designed to bring to you in accessible ways, talking about what archaeology is learning, different aspects of archaeology. And so we do that through programs like this. We have a YouTube channel, we have social media. So check us out if you like. And if you like this podcast, leave us a review. That kind of feedback is good. And we'll see you next time.
All right. See y'all later.